Yo, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. It's your boy TNL, and today we're going to be talking why I think you're easier to replace than you actually think. And there's a very hard truth that a lot of people will avoid because it feels very uncomfortable to hear, but most people think that they're secure where they actually are. It's secure in their job, in their relationship, whether it's, their place in the world or, whatever they think they bring to the table. And I'm not trying to say this to scare you, but I'm saying it because a lot of people will move through life like they have way more time, way more leverage, way more protection than they really do in our lifetime. The truth is, if all you offer is what 1,000 other people also offer, you're easier to replace than you think. And that sounds very harsh, but if you really understand it, it can become one of the most useful realizations that you can have in your life. Because the goal isn't for you to panic when you hear something like this, but the goal is to wake up if you're not already awoken. A lot of people grew up believing that if they do what they're told, life will sort itself out. Go to school, get a job, work hard, be responsible, all that, stay out of trouble. And to be fair, that advice isn't completely wrong, but it's incomplete because the world simply just changed. Hard work still matters, but hard work by itself doesn't protect you the way people think it does. There are hardworking people getting laid off, hardworking people getting passed over, hardworking people staying underpaid for years upon years, hardworking people doing everything quote unquote right, but still feeling like they, are barely moving the needle. And that's because effort matters, but value matters more. And I think that's a lot of what people never fully understand, because being a good person doesn't automatically make you more valuable in the marketplace, but and being loyal doesn't automatically make you hard to replace. Showing up every day doesn't automatically make you indispensable. You can be dependable, you can be kind, you can be disciplined, and still be replaceable if what you do is a very common, easy to copy, or disconnected from, real leverage. And that's the truth. Like if you're a cashier, like it's going to be a lot easier for you to be replaced because a cashier is a job that a lot of people can do. All you gotta do is know basic math, really, to be honest, and have decent customer service. You know, I think a lot of people feel this deep down already. That quiet anxiety. The feeling that if one thing fell apart, you're not sure how protected you really are. But not because you're simply lazy, not because you're stupid, but because modern life rewards specific kinds of value now. And if you're not building them, life gets more fragile than it looks. The scary part is that most people don't realize they're replaceable until life forces them to see it. A job lets them go, an industry shifts, technology changes, a relationship ends, an opportunity disappears. And suddenly they're looking around thinking, wait, I thought I was safer than this. That moment hurts, that realization hurts. But it also teaches them something very important. You never want your entire life resting on one weak pillar, on one paycheck, on one skill, on one company, on one version of yourself, on one source of validation. Because anything built too narrowly becomes very fragile. And fragile things break when pressure shows up. That's just the truth. I think a lot of people confuse being busy with being valuable. I think they're always doing something. They're always tired, they're always occupied, they're always moving. But movement and progress are not the same thing necessarily. A person can be busy for 10 years and stay highly replaceable. Why? Because they never built anything deeper than that. They never learned how to communicate at a high level, never had to learn how to sell, never learned how to solve harder problems, never learned how to lead people. They never learned how to think independently. They never learned how to, become difficult to ignore in the world. They stayed active. But they didn't become more powerful. And that's a huge difference. And honestly, this doesn't just apply to work, it applies to life in general. Like when, some people are easier to replace in relationships, because they never developed an emotional depth to themselves. Some people are replaceable socially because they never built a real identity that people respected. Some people are maybe more replaceable professionally because they never became better than average at anything or whatever they were doing. And I'm not saying that to insult anybody or insult you watching this if that may have offended you. I'm saying it because average has become extremely crowded. That's the real issue. There are millions of people doing the minimum, millions of people copying each other, millions of people with the surface level skills, millions of people who want better lives without becoming stronger people. So if you stay ordinary on purpose, the world will eventually treat you like you're easy, someone easy to swap out, someone easy to get rid of, to replace, because from the outside you are in a sense. And maybe that's the real problem. A lot of people want rich results from, an average development. They want extraordinary freedom with ordinary effort, They want a life nobody can take from them while never building anything rare enough to protect them. But the world doesn't really work like that, now does it? If you want more security, you need more substance. If you want more freedom, you need more value in the world. If you want more money, you usually need to become more useful. That doesn't mean becoming fake. It means becoming stronger, sharper, more capable, more complete at whatever you truly want to do. I think one of the biggest lies modern culture will tell people is that self-expression is enough. That being you is enough. And I get the intention behind that because you always should be yourself, but you shouldn't hate yourself. You shouldn't live a fake life. You shouldn't become someone you're not. But if being yourself means staying stagnant, underdeveloped, underfocused, underdisciplined, then that version of you will stay vulnerable. Because the world doesn't reward potential. It rewards developed ability. That's a hard truth. No one pays you for what you could be. They pay you for what you can do. People don't trust you because of your intentions. They trust you because of your demonstrated value over and over and over again. And your future changes the moment you stop relying on potential and start building proof. So how do you become harder to replace in your life? It starts by becoming useful in ways that are hard to fake. Learn how to communicate clearly. That alone can separate you from most people. Learn how to solve real problems, not just small ones, not just like repetitive ones, which will help, but real ones. Learn how to stay calm under pressure. That matters more than people think. Learn how to sell. If you can create value but you can't explain it, you'll stay invisible. Learn how to focus. Most people are too distracted to go deep enough to become excellent. Learn how to keep learning. That's very important also, because the second you stop evolving yourself, the world will start to catch up to you and, maybe zoom past you. And the things that I just named aren't flashy skills, but they can quietly change everything for you because they make you more adaptable to situations. And adaptability is one of the highest forms of security now. That's another thing people overlook. In today's world, being hard to replace doesn't always mean being the absolute best, but sometimes it means, being the one who keeps growing, the one who can adjust to things, the one who can learn a new system, maybe a new tool, a new industry, just a new way to create value. Because industries tend to change over years. Technology advances, AI is going to boom and change throughout the next few years as it's been recently. The market's going to change. What made you valuable 5 years ago may not be the same 5 years from now. That's what I'm trying to say basically. So the real edge is not just one skill. It's becoming the type of person who can keep building new ones. And that's very powerful, because once you know how to become valuable, you stop feeling so trapped by one version of your life. And on a human level, I think that this matters because insecurity is exhausting. It's very exhausting. Feeling like life could just fall apart if one thing changes, that will wear and tear on you. And it affects the way you think, the way you sleep, the way you maybe can negotiate things in your future, the way you walk into a room. When you know you don't have much leverage, you feel it. You tolerate more, you ask for less, you settle faster, you panic easier. But when you build real value, something in you shifts. You carry yourself way differently, not because your ego got bigger, but because your options got bigger. And options create a calm sense. That's why people that's why what people really want, not just money, not just status. Sorry, let me rephrase this. That's what people really want. Not just money, not just status, a calm. The kind of calm that comes from knowing, if this falls apart, I can still rebuild it. That's what being hard to replace really gives you. That's what being hard to replace really gives you. And I think this is especially important in your 20s and your early 30s, because there are years where a lot of people were still coasting off of assumptions that there will be more time, more chances, more security, maybe more time for rescue. But life gets even more expensive down the line. You might get a wife, that you have to cover for two people now. Y'all might have kids, and now you have to provide for more people. Now that's a whole other set of expenses. Maybe you got a house now, like things are going to compile, it's going to get more expensive, more competitive, more selective. And if you're not building yourself while you still have flexibility to do it, you'll eventually pay for that delay. And it won't all happen at once, right? But it'll happen quietly and slowly, maybe in lower confidence over a little bit, maybe in smaller opportunities, maybe in a weaker leverage that you have, in more dependent on things outside of your control. And that's the real cost of staying replaceable. So no, this isn't about becoming paranoid. It's about becoming more intentional. It's about looking at your life honestly and asking, if I lost this tomorrow, what would still be mine? What skills would still be mine? What abilities would still be mine? What reputation would still be mine? What value could I still bring anywhere? That's the question. Because people who become hard to replace are not the people who cling to comfort. They're the people who build themselves into an asset. Everywhere they go, they carry value with them. That's why they don't panic the same way that you might panic. That's why they recover faster. That's why they move differently. They didn't just hope life would keep them safe. They made themselves stronger so that life had to prepare for them. And maybe that's the real point of all this. Not to make you afraid of being replaceable, but to remind you that you don't have to stay that way. You can become sharper. You can become more useful. You can become more disciplined. You can become harder to ignore. You can become the kind of person whose value doesn't just disappear just because one opportunity does. That's available to you. But it starts with honesty, honestly. And the honesty is this: if you don't build yourself on purpose, the world will eventually show you where you're weak. So build now and learn now and develop now, because the goal isn't just making money, but the goal is becoming the kind of person that can't easily be pushed around. And that kind of strength is worth everything. Thank you for your time, though. It's TNL.